Good afternoon, everyone. People can hear me? All right, perfect. My name is Sonia Hurt, and I'm the Dean of the College of Environment and Design. I want to thank you all for coming here today on this beautiful day. I'm sure that there were many competing demands for your time, but I do promise you that you're all in here for a very special treat. So it is my great honor to introduce you to Deborah Berke, who is a world-renowned architect and educator. She's the Edward P. Bass Dean and Hoppin Professor of Architecture at Yale University, where she has taught since 1987. She is the first woman to hold the position of Dean of Yale School of Architecture. Dean Berke is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and founder of the New York-based architecture firm Ten Berke. Among the firm's most significant works are the residential colleges at Princeton University, the Rockefeller Art Center at SUNY Fredonia, and the Yale School of Art in New Haven. In 2017, her firm was honored with the National Design Award from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Dean Berke is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design and the City University of New York. She holds a degree in fine arts, in architecture, in urban planning, and in urban design, as well as an honorary doctorate in fine arts from the Rhode Island School of Design. Her awards and recognitions are too many to be listed in a few minutes, and since I'm in front of the computer and I'm seeing that there are 200 slides, I can assure you that I'm going to be very quick about this. So this is just a small sampling. Dean Berke is the recipient of the Topaz Medallion, which is the highest honor in architectural education. She was the inaugural designate of the Berkeley Rupp Prize at the University of California, Berkeley, which is given to an architect who has advanced the position of women in the profession and whose work emphasizes community and sustainability. She is a board member of the James Howell Foundation and an advisor to the Norman Foster Foundation. She also serves, I just don't know where to stop. She also serves on the jury for the Pritzker Architecture Prize. She's one of a handful of architects and other designers to be a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Academy is about 300 people from all over the country, so this is just an enormous accomplishment. And she's also a member of the National Academy of Design. Her latest honor is coming from the American Institute of Architects, and this is the highest honor that the AIA can give to an individual, which is their gold medal. So as you can see, we are very privileged today to have Dean Berke among us. She so kindly agreed to visit us despite her overwhelming schedule. She just got here a couple hours ago, lecturing, having dinner with us, and immediately going back to her normal life. I don't know whether it's normal, but busy life. Her lecture is on a topic that is very well related to the core of our college. We have, of course, as those of you who are outside of the college, programs in landscape architecture, environmental ethics, urban planning and design, and historic preservation, and her topic is right on target. The topic, as you can see, is transform the art of adaptive reuse and giving old buildings a new life. So this is a college lecture, as well as a university lecture. This is part of the Provost Seminar Series. Only a couple of people are selected for this lecture by the Provost Office every semester. So I do not see the Provost, but I want to thank the Office of the Provost for their generous support. And on the CED side, this is supported by our AGOR endowment, and I want to thank Mary and Bob Hughes, who are here in the audience, for actually creating this endowment, which is our largest endowment for public lectures. So thank you again for coming, and especially thanks for Dean Berke, and we are all looking forward to her presentation.
Thank you, Sonia. That was very, very nice. And for those of you who are daunted at the prospect of 200 slides, I promise you I'll either go very fast and or I won't be insulted if you get up and leave. Either is totally fine. I have never been to Athens, Georgia before. It is delightful to be someplace where it is 70 degrees outside, because when I left my apartment this morning in New York, it was 25. And I show you this picture because it says happy building on it. And while I know there isn't an architecture school here per se, there are many things that happen on college campuses that relate to buildings, and I think we should be celebratory about buildings, particularly this beautiful old one that we happen to be in this afternoon. Now, before I dive into the meat of the lecture, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am from New York City. It's about 1,000 miles north of here. I was raised in the borough of Queens, which is the red thing on the screen. It's probably best known for being the most diverse county in the United States. 2.25 million people live there, and they come from hundreds of different places around the world and speak over 800 different languages as their native tongue. 192 different languages are spoken in the public schools in Queens. I went to New York City public schools as a kid, and then to an all-girls boarding school in northwestern Massachusetts as a scholarship student. That was a bit of a dramatic change. I then, as Sonia noted, went to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is an art school. I started studying art and then studied architecture. When I got out of school, there was a recession, a very, very severe one. There was no work for architects, so my very first job was as a graphic designer in a global engineering firm, and this is the work I did during that time. It explains oil storage in the salt domes in Louisiana. It wasn't really the right job for me, although it was kind of fun making, these were slides, and we painted them and put colored film on the slides. It was the olden days, no computers. So I hated that job, so I got a job teaching in a program that was once offered by the National Endowment for the Arts, and it's actually a shame it doesn't exist anymore. What it did was put artists, architects, dancers, poets, composers, painters, you name it, in public elementary schools throughout the country to teach students who maybe weren't being reached through the normal, learn your math, learn how to read curriculum, and the hope was to inspire them to learn through other means. So one of the things you see here are little kids learning how bricks hold together. You see kids laying out an imaginary village. You see a kid measuring a classroom so that they could build a model of the classroom, which is what you see on the bottom left. They couldn't understand fractions until they built a scale model, and suddenly fractions became completely evident. There are a bunch of 9-year-olds in that picture. So that got me into teaching, and then along with a friend, I founded a program for high school students at a place in New York called the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. I don't think there are many architects in the room, but it was Peter Eisenman's New York think tank, where Rem Koolhaas made his first appearance in the United States, and a bunch of other noted architectural thinkers. You can see me giving tours to the students. I had much less white hair then. I might be a little bit about my life that caused all my hair to turn white. But after doing this for a few years, I went back to school to get a master's degree in urban planning because I was frustrated by the limitations of working in cities that were placed on architects, and I thought planners and urban designers might be able to have a greater impact. That turned out to be wrong, but we'll get to that later. And then following getting that degree, I got a visiting teaching gig at the University of Miami, and following that, spent many summers in the Florida Panhandle building houses in Seaside, which is the first built example of the new urbanism, and I will tell you quite candidly, I have a very complex relationship with the new urbanism. We can talk about that later. And when the dean at the University of Miami became the dean at the University of Maryland, he recruited me to apply for a position as an assistant professor there. Started a tiny practice in Washington, D.C., but mostly did little projects elsewhere, and then got recruited to apply for a job at Yale. Moved my practice back to New York, which was my hometown. It was good to be close to my parents, who were getting older, and it made sense to be back. I don't know where any of you are from. I assume most of you are from Georgia, but there's something nice about being close to home. Back then, I had the optimism. I think all architects are optimists, basically, but I had the optimism, presumptuousness even, and self-confidence of me who was many, many years younger than the me talking to you today. I'm still an architect. As I said, I think architects are optimists. It's a very forward-looking profession, and you're making something that's going to be used in the future, and hopefully it will make the future better. But let's be honest, there are many architects who are highly ambitious. This is a section through an architect's brain. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but the biggest part of the cerebral matter seems to be ambition. There's fame, awards, projects, ethics, a little bit down at the bottom. I think you teach that here. Creativity. Anyway, I'll send this to anybody who wants it. And I, in addition to being optimistic and I'm ambitious, I must admit, do truly believe that the truest measure of good design, at whatever scale, from a piece of, from nanotechnology to regional planning and everything in between, that the truest measure of good design is the good that it does in the world. And that is the sort of base ethic with which I run my practice and with which I've tried to lead the School of Architecture at Yale. So I'm very, very quickly going to show you, you're going to see these 200 slides are going to be done like that. I'm going to show you a bunch of projects, just quickly illustrated by one image each. A library in Hope, Indiana, that's a gathering place for the elderly in the community, as well as the kids after school. A photo studio in an old auto repair garage in New York's West Village, where we kept the old windows and exposed the old trusses, completely transforming its use. A drive-through bank in Columbus, Indiana, that was meant to give as much architectural attention to this tiny little building as the enormous big box stores that were around it. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but it starred in the film Columbus, which came out about 5 years ago, where the young woman is obsessed with the building. Art galleries in Manhattan. I think part of the pleasure of being an architect or a designer is in composition itself, so sometimes just very simple compositions, very simple materials. But recently, and the subject of this lecture tonight, is in collaboration with Thomas de Monchaux, who teaches at Columbia, and with Arthi Krishnamurti, who's a partner at Ten Berke, we together wrote a book called Transform, which came out last year, which is about a fairly radical approach to adaptive reuse. So that's what this talk is about. It's about giving old buildings new life. So the first project I'm going to talk about is a project in the Dixwell neighborhood of New Haven, Connecticut. The project was imagined by this artist, Titus Kaffar, a painter who received his MFA from Yale. He and I had never met at Yale, but we met through the 21C Museum hotels, which you're going to see some of in a few minutes. The owners of the hotels collect his work. And we discovered how our lives overlapped through clients, collectors, institutions, and certain very strongly held beliefs. And he imagined that he could create a place where artists could do residencies and not only improve the nature of their work and have time to do their work, but also get guidance and advice on how to sell their work, how to maintain intellectual property rights, what was a fair arrangement with a gallery, all of the things that, quite frankly, art school doesn't really teach. So he was able to buy for $1 each, $2, two old industrial buildings in the city of New Haven. The one closer to you in this slide is where they manufactured chemistry vials for the chemistry department at Yale. And the one further down the block, also brick, was where was an ice cream factory. We demolished the parts that were not saving, the later piece between the two, and we renovated the beautiful parts with what we could celebrate, and then we added what was missing, a new gasket between the two and a new building behind it that you see the taller volume in pale blue. You can see the plan here. The buildings didn't even really align, but so what you see in the part of the building to the right, which was the old ice cream factory, studios for artists. In the middle, where the number 2 is the gallery, which shows the work of the artists who work here, as well as emerging artists from around the world. And then the test tube building, where the number 3 is, has smaller workspaces for graphic designers and architects, and a big room called the Aula, which is open to the community. So during the worst of COVID, they did COVID testing here, they gave vaccines here. At Thanksgiving, they give food to the community. You can have community events here. And then the new building at the top has live-work studios in it, where some of the artists who get the stipends and the residencies also have a place to stay. Down in the basement, there's a jazz theater and other workshop spaces and a wood shop and other facilities. And up above, is that, oh, I'm sorry. Oh well, badly cropped, my apologies, are the additional residential places. If you are lucky enough to be in residence here, you get a stipend in addition to being able to work for a year, and you get introduced to galleries in New York. So the building looks like this. It is a new community hub, as I described. There are 12 residences for artists each year and 2 residential curators who learn how to actually curate. And interestingly enough, it has become even more difficult to get into than the Yale School of Art, which is an MFA graduate program with an acceptance rate of about 6%. So this is really hard to get accepted at because of the kind of support it offers young artists. So you get a sense of the building here, and one of the big impacts about this building, this is in not a particularly, what one would describe as not a particularly good neighborhood, quote unquote, is the glass in the front doesn't have pull-down gates. It's totally safe. People are meant to feel that they can come in anytime. There's skateboarding out in front for the kids, and we did the addition in a basket weave pattern of brick that was meant to say to the neighborhood, something special is actually going on here. This is what the inside looks like, and one of the things we cared a lot about was showing the layers of what had been there before. So we didn't paint over this brick wall. We actually celebrated the discovery of essentially layers upon layers of use over the years. This is the gallery where the work of the fellows is shown. This is the aula where we did even more to celebrate the textures of what was there, to find the beauty in the history and the past. One of the things they do at Next Haven is have a paid apprentice program. There's a big city high school half a block away. They employ students from the high school, they pay them, they do apprentice work for the artists, and one of the ideas, not only is in these students making money, is that they can also see that there might be a future career in the arts or in arts-related, arts-supported fields. You get a sense of that pattern of the walls, something I was so excited about as we were doing this project. And elsewhere in the building where we had to add heating and air conditioning, we let all that stuff show. The idea here was not to be precious, not to hide anything, have it look like spaces where the artists could do whatever to those spaces they needed and wanted to do to create their work. This is an office and library and hangout space, and this is one of the young artists who's working there today. So we have the great privilege in my office of doing a lot of work for artists' organizations. You may recognize the name Albee. Edward Albee was a great American playwright. He too had a foundation to support writers and painters. He bought this old dairy barn in Montauk, which is the easternmost tip of Long Island. And for years, artists stayed in here. That was essentially what they gave them. What he gave them was, here, camp out in this barn where it's cold and the mosquitoes come in, but you can do your work. And they kind of worked in places like this. It was an honor to be there because it was Albee, but it wasn't a particularly great environment to do your work in. When Albee died, his possessions and estates were handled by Sotheby's, a lot of money was raised, and they had the ability to actually turn this residential artist foundation into a genuine foundation. So when we went back to look at how to save that barn, we had to bring it to contemporary code, meaning it had to be ADA accessible and fireproofed in certain ways. So what you see in the drawing are the two #1 spaces. Those are spaces for painters. The two number 2 spaces are spaces for writers. There are only 4 people here at a time. You see a communal kitchen where they make and have their meals together. And then upstairs, you see 4 bedrooms, one for each artist, each with their own bathroom, and then a big library which houses Albie's actual personal library, which the artists and writers use for reference. This is it now. This is not a rendering. This just got finished, and the first artists are in residence. So I believe in saving old buildings. I passionately believe in saving old buildings. This was a rundown, falling apart, termite-riddled barn from the 1920s. And if you remember from that first picture, it had narrow little dormers with tiny little pointy roofs. And there was no way we could make a plan work that kept those dormers. So we had a certain level of, there are times when you are reverential about a building, and there are times when you're like, hey, let's go for it. So here, the hey, let's go for it was, let's just make one giant long dormer so it actually works for the program that it is meant to have. So here you get some sense of it. There's another little building where the caretaker lives, also an old farm building. There we just put on new roof, new shingles, new windows, and you get a sense of the compound here. Sorry, you can see I go through slides very quickly, so I won't be here for long. This is a view inside. We just finished this, so I'm very proud to be able to show you pictures. And this is the library upstairs. And of course, while we may have been a bit cavalier about the dormers, we were very, very precious and respectful of the old timbers that framed the barn from the very beginning. Trees this size no longer grow on Eastern Long Island, certainly not to build buildings like this. So we really wanted to celebrate them and hang on to them and the story they told about when this building was from. I think you can apply, if you're drawn at all, to what these images look like. Oh yeah, that's putting it back together. I spend a fair amount of time on the eastern end of Long Island. People say bad things about the Hamptons, but it has a long and very interesting history. It was settled in the 1640s, not by people heading east from New York City, but people heading south from Connecticut across Long Island Sound to go to a place where the soils were better. This house was built in 1884. It was a boarding house, and it was built right after the train went to East Hampton from Manhattan. People who were rich enough to take a few days off came here. They weren't rich enough to have their own cottages by the sea, and so you could rent a room in this house. It lasted as a guest house from 1884 to 1919, when it was bought by a family who sold it in 2021. So they had it for more than 100 years. You can see the shape of the parcel. You can see the Atlantic Ocean in the picture at the bottom. It's approximately a 4-acre site, which in the Hamptons right now is vast. And it looks like this. You may have noticed in that first image I showed you, there was a historic postcard, and the house had a dormer on the front. So we got historic permission, this is a historic building, to replace that dormer. We had to install sprinklers in this building. In New York State, anyhow, you can't build a house more than 2 stories tall. This is 4 stories tall, so for people to sleep in it, it had to be sprinklered. We lifted the entire building up and slid it back a little bit further away from the street and put a new addition on it where the old addition had been. From 1884 until 2024, the house had no heat, and it was used by the family who owned it for 100 years solely as a summer cottage. They would open the windows and the breeze from the ocean would come through. The current owner wanted heat and air conditioning and a proper foundation. If you are in the historic preservation program, you'll be interested to know that this house, the old house, had a foundation that had lasted, for 140 years, of locust poles driven into the sand. And what we did when we saved it was lift the thing up, take the poles out, they were still perfect, and build actually a proper concrete basement. So here you see it in its recently finished state. We saved things like the stair rail and the old floors. It took a lot of work and a staggering amount of money, quite frankly, to save this house. The owner collects old things, so she was really in the spirit of the building. This iron bed frame was actually from the house and dated all the way back to when it was a rooming house for people going to the beach. The doors all still had the numbers on them 140 years later, so we restored the doors and saved the numbers and put them back on. There were funky old light fixtures, we kept those, but we added new spaces that were more conducive to 21st century living. We used old wood wherever we could find it, recycling it from other aspects of parts of the buildings we had to replace. We used the old bathtubs and had them refinished. And here you see what it was like to lift it. So the addition, you could see in the house where there had been an addition. It was where the servant's kitchen was, so we sliced that off. We built a new addition, and you can see it all the way to the left of the image. And then the red thing you see on the top of the concrete wall are the rails by which they slid the house back from the road so that it could, so you see it? It's sliding back to join the new addition and be a little bit more private than it was when it was built in 1884, where everybody wanted to live right on the road. And so that's the final step of the recreation of this house on a proper foundation. Here you get the view from the other side of this process happening. I don't know what you do in Georgia. In New England and Long Island, the moving of wood frame buildings is something that's been happening for 300 years, and we continue to do it. And in my opinion, it's always better to save these buildings than to tear them down, even if that means lifting them up and taking them, whether it's 50 feet or a few miles, so that they can continue to live useful lives. You can see some of what it takes to be able to move a house. I won't walk you through the plans other than to give you a sense of it's a big house. It has many, many, many bedrooms, and it is her goal. She has a huge family that it's used for family gatherings over the summer and in the wintertime for writers. So I'm going to change location from Eastern Long Island to Philadelphia and talk about a project in which we were absolutely non-reverential at all. We were brutal. We conducted surgery. So you see these houses. They are part of the University of Pennsylvania, 2 conjoined townhouses that were a rabbit's warren of rooms that had been badly renovated with hung ceilings over different periods, different times, different department, secretarial offices moving in and out. Immediately next door, hidden by the big green tree, is where the president of the University of Pennsylvania lives. And she wanted there to be appropriate guest rooms, which her house didn't have, as well as space for trustees meetings. And so Penn came to us and said, what can we do about these houses? And we said, well, how about something like this? Slice the back of them off and make them do all the things that you need this building to do, including meet code, have rooms big enough to meet your programmatic needs, but save the front of them because they contribute to this very historic streetscape going through an old part of Philadelphia. You get a sense of the plan here. We took out the party wall in certain locations to make big rooms, like the big pale blue room. The pale lavender room at the lower left is actually at grade, so you can enter, and then there is an elevator that takes you to all the levels. It had been inaccessible before. The only way you could get in was to go up the front steps. You can see other meeting rooms and then a series of bedrooms as you go further up in the house, as well as offices for the kinds of people who would come to speak at commencement, or they are members of the Board of Trustees there at Penn. So our attitude here was, we're not going to make a building that looks like the front buildings. They are of another time, another place, another set of skills, building skills, and for a very different program when they were built. We are going to work with them, in effect, and make one building out of the two things together by matching color and texture. So the old building, as you can tell, is brick. The new building is terracotta in a color that was custom made to match the brick. But it has very much its own compositional strategy, material approach, and kind of 21st century mindset about how you build. We did keep the historic stuff inside. We toned it down a little, but you could see the columns and the fireplace mantle. But in the new spaces, they felt absolutely new. I've had a great good time doing these 21C Museum hotels that I referred to earlier, talking about how I had met Titus Kaphar. Walking over here, I spoke to somebody who had stayed in one of them. They're sort of scattered across the South. I think the nearest one to where we are is in Durham. We got to turn this extraordinary building, which is a Ford assembly plant in Oklahoma City. So when Fords were first being made, if you've ever had IKEA furniture, you know it all comes flat and you put it together. So that's how they made the first Fords. They shipped them like flat pack furniture and then assembled them in regionally located facilities. So it was a great model because it doesn't make sense to ship air, which was the inside of an old Ford. But gradually these buildings ran out of purpose. And this had been owned by the same family since it had been designed for Ford and them by the great American architect Albert Kahn. Not Louis Kahn, also a great American architect, but Albert Kahn. So this is what the building looks like now. What this hotel did was not only give new use to an abandoned building, but it brought life to this part of the city, which was kind of at the edge of where anybody went when they were walking through downtown. Now, this is what used to happen in the building, so it was vast. It was a gigantic city block. Looked like this on the inside. I mean, you could barely see the end of it with the vanishing point. It was robust, as you might imagine. You get some sense of that looking at this column, strong enough to hold cars and all that equipment. Very, very thick concrete floor plates, and very, very deep in plan. So not one part of that was good for laying out a hotel. So we cut holes in it where we could, because there was a lot of rebar running through. We had the old Kahn drawings. We could see where the rebar was. So we located our holes where there was the least amount of rebar, sent them through the whole four-story building, lit them. You can see them here. So in the hallways, they sort of punctuated the rhythm of the columns. You're about halfway down a hallway here, so you get some sense of the beautiful endless repetition of these columns and the spots of light that the holes we cut brought through. And you can see them here in the section. They're labeled the number 5s, which are the skylights that went through. One of the things that allowed us to do was to put guest rooms that faced those. So they had natural light and a sense of being unique, and they were certainly very quiet, so they ended up being popular rooms. But it allowed the floor plan layout for a hotel to make a whole lot more sense. The other thing we did, as you noticed in the hallways, was wherever we found these spectacular columns, we tried to celebrate them. So the bar literally wraps around the column. We sealed them so that no toxic paint ended up in anybody's lives, but we kept the paint or the scraps of paint and the finishes on them as we found them. And this was an extraordinarily fun and exciting project to work on. The one I'm about to show you has an extraordinary history, but it's not a fun story. Not all projects get built, even ones that have important missions. This is another adaptive reuse. So the building you see here was called Siemens House. It was built by Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. They happen to also be the architects of the bank in downtown Durham, where there's a 21C hotel, but they are most famous as being the architects of the Empire State Building, and they were great Art Deco architects. This building was built in the 30s, and it was meant to be a kind of YMCA for sailors from freight ships that would come into New York Harbor when New York Harbor was one of the country's most vibrant freight harbors. And you can see, it's subtle, it was built on a low budget, but if you squint at the decorative terracotta here, you actually see the front of a ship, right? So there was this kind of emblematic treatment throughout the entire building. The cages you see over the windows tell a much sadder story. So this is what it was like in its heyday. Merchant Marine Memorial Building, sailors out in front. They could pick up mail here, get a haircut here, swim in the pool. You see more beautiful decorative tile work, learn about a trade that might keep them on terra firma. And you can see what a bedroom was like. It was relatively civilized for a man who had spent months and months and months on a ship. So there were those public spaces at the bottom of the building and then endless floors. It was an E-shaped building, wings with tiny private rooms, 6.5 feet by 10 feet. They wanted the men only to sleep in the rooms and then be out in the city or out learning skills, getting their mail, swimming, etc. Unfortunately, these tiny rooms made this building very amenable to its next life. In 1967, it was turned into a drug rehabilitation center, and in 1974, it was converted into a women's prison run by the state of New York. It was called the Bayview Correctional Facility. It operated in Manhattan without really anybody noticing it was there. They would move the prisoners in and out at about 3 o'clock in the morning. In 2012, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York and much of the Northeast, it flooded the building all the way up to the second floor, sort of at the top of the decorative piece at the front door on the corner. That's how high the Hudson River came. So the women were moved out of the facility, and faced with the severity of the flood damage, the building was then decommissioned as a prison. This is what it was like as a prison. And in that room where the sailor had one bed, there were triple high bunk beds for the women prisoners. It had the highest rate of sexual assault within the New York State prison system, which is nothing to brag about. So in 2015, the state of New York had an open RFP competition for people with ideas for this building. And an organization called the Novo Foundation, which is a social justice foundation, went to the state with a proposal to reimagine the building as something they wanted to call the Women's Building, which would be a place where foundations dedicated to issues around women and girls globally, health, education, job training, et cetera, could house their offices together to save time, be more efficient, and have a series of programs in the building, a broadcasting room, an auditorium, the daycare, a restaurant, all the things you might want in a place where NGOs and not-for-profits and other organizations shared space. So they had a design competition, which we won. And this was our competition entry drawing. We took the middle of the E branches out to make a big upper courtyard protecting users of the building from the winds that would come off the Hudson River. And we spent a year listening to what the various users and organizations wanted to do in this building. Art gallery, gym, instruction about opening a not-for-profit. We had street fairs where people could come and share ideas, people from the neighborhood. We spoke to leaders of women's and girls' rights organizations. We had an opportunity for people to draw their ideas if they wanted to, and you'll notice in this slide that little corner entrance to the original building is actually to the right of the tree. So one of the things we learned, we spoke to an organization of women who had been incarcerated in this building. And we had thought, okay, we are going to respect their stories. We will save a cell so that people understand how horrible it would have been to be in a cell in this building. And the women said, no, no, no. You have to save a hallway with cells on both sides, because one of the most humiliating things that happened here was not what happened when you were in your cell, but how you were shouted at by the guards and others when you were handcuffed and walked down the hallway to your cell. So people need to understand that horrible experience of being in prison. So we really did a deep dive in thinking about how to turn this building into its use. The other interesting thing about talking to the women who had been incarcerated there was that they knew the history of the building, even though it's happier history, even though they had never seen any of that. The pool had been shuttered for a long time, and all of the buildings, air conditioning and heating equipment was in the old pool, but the mosaics remained, and so they wanted that to be saved, even though they had never seen it. It was also possible to add to the building, and the program required additional square footage. So we started doing diagrams of where we would add, how we would organize, how you could have the organizations talk to each other, where the public would be able to go, what would be shared spaces, and then asked ourselves, what should this building look like? Because in the time from when Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon did a YMCA for sailors to when the arts moved into Chelsea, the neighborhood had changed quite a bit, including there's a lot of flash in the neighborhood, you know, Bjarke Engel's buildings and Frank Gehry buildings. So what do you do when you're making a foundation and a center in a neighborhood with a lot of glitz? So we tested ideas. How solid should it be? How glassy should it be? How do we find the right balance? Is it appropriately sustainable in a city like New York with the amount of sun coming from the west, the wind coming off the river, and what does it look like? So we got all the way through construction documents. For those of you who are architects, you know what that means. And the project was canceled. It was canceled because a combination of meeting New York State Historic Preservation Code and the FEMA regulations relating to how high the floodwaters would come in the future made it so staggeringly expensive that even this very well-endowed foundation felt that doing the building was not where they should be spending their money, when they should be spending their money on more mission-driven work. So you throw your heart and soul into projects and they don't always happen. You do learn from them. So this is another building with a troubled history. I promise you I'm going to be done soon. And this is a building by H.H. Richardson in Buffalo, New York. After the Civil War in the 1870s and 80s, there were a series of hospitals built across the entire country, north and south, all the way up to the Mississippi River, that were essentially, today we would call them insane asylums, but then they were quite progressive, and they were thought about by this psychiatrist named Kirkbride. Some remain, many have been torn down. This particular one, as you can see from this photograph, was a striking structure. In its heyday, it was as long as the red outline on this drawing. It was more than 1/4 of a mile long, and the more crazy you were, the further you were from the center. Men in one direction, women in the other direction, one door at the middle, period. So all of the Kirkbride hospitals had roughly this plan, and they had different exteriors depending on who the architect was. Where you see the red outline sitting on top of black buildings, that wing of this hospital was torn down in the 1960s when New York State built more up-to-date psychiatric hospitals. But the rest of the building remained pretty much a ruin. So when we started working on it, it looked like this, and you can see that sort of clunky paler thing made out of concrete block with the shallow arches in the middle was added in the 1940s. And it was a load-bearing brick building, so at the bottom floor, the walls were 3.5 feet thick in brick. It was poignant to be there. It looked like this. And one of the interesting things about the Kirkbride method was that the rooms for the patients were only on the north side of the hallway, because during the day, if you were well enough, you worked outside in the garden. And if you weren't well, your cot was brought out into the hallway so you could be in the sunshine all day. So they were single-loaded corridors, the height of inefficiency. The corridors were 16 feet wide and the rooms were only 11 feet wide. And this gives you a sense, again, you know, small rooms, the story of my design life. But because you get some other sense of what this building was like, the public spaces were actually quite beautiful. Treasures like this fireplace, and then this sort of just poignancy of, you know, 90 years of being used as an asylum, maybe with little care for the people who actually were being treated there. What was interesting is that the reason this building was still standing was because the neighbors worked for 20 years to save it. They did car washes and bake sales, and on Halloween they did haunted house tours. As you might imagine, it was very successful as a haunted house. And fought and fought and fought until finally the state of New York provided enough additional funding and tax breaks to allow the center part, so the part with the towers, where the one door was, and one wing to each side, to be turned into a hotel, which we were hired to do. And the one thing we changed on the outside was to add this glass box, which sits back of Richardson. So we never did anything in front of Richardson. Much more reverential here than in some of the other buildings I've shown you about the history of this building. But this was the side that didn't have the door on it originally. So this was the side you needed to arrive at now for this to work as a hotel, so we gave it, in effect, a new front door. This is what happens when you come in because of the level change. There's an architectural kind of foundation and gallery underneath the stairs, and you go up the stairs or up an elevator to the main level, kind of piano nobile floor, where the check-in is, and a bar and a restaurant. We made access across some of the quirkier places in the building with new bridges. We celebrated the architecture that we found. We thought, hey, let's use bright colors, why not? Let's keep the beautiful things that were there, stair railings, moldings, beautiful, beautiful woodwork, exquisite tile work. This is one of those curving connectors. This is that fireplace you saw in the rundown picture a few images ago, now in a lounge area. And these are the hallways. So when we started on the project, the developer said, well, I have a great idea. The hallways are 16 feet wide. Let's make the hallways the guest rooms and make the old rooms for the patients. The hallways will just make a door and a door and a door and a door and a door, and it will become the hallway. And we essentially said, no, you can't destroy the history of this building, which is told in its layout, of how sun, even in 1880, they knew that being in the sun would make people who were, I think, basically suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They didn't have that phrase then. They needed the sunshine, and we needed to respect that history. So the funny little bumps you see were things we added in order to make bathroom layouts work. So they're meant to look like a little piece of furniture pushed up against the wall. But other than that, we kept the hallways. This is what the guest rooms were like. The ceiling height was beautiful throughout this building. You're going to think I have a column obsession. When we found good columns, we saved them. We didn't take the paint off this one either. And we used our new addition. They have good weather in Buffalo about 3 weeks a year, but then you can have a drink outside. And here you get a sense of what it's like now that it's actually functioning as a hotel. It's across the street from the State University of New York Buffalo campus, so they have a lot of visiting speakers here and lectures, and go for drinks after classes, have conference here, et cetera. Getting to the end, I promise you. This is an old New York City public school. I don't know if any of you have been to New York or noticed that all the public schools look alike. This was built in 1894. The architect was a guy named C.B.J. Snyder. This was when New York was being a huge influx, Statue of Liberty, immigrants, and C.B.J. Snyder worked for the Board of Education of the City of New York and designed 400 public schools, all of which essentially look the same. This one is on First Avenue in the East Village, PS 122, and it served as a public school until 1976. And if the outside or the inside looks familiar to you, it's because Fame was filmed here. This is the artist Keith Haring in his studio. So when the city abandoned the building, it was taken over kind of guerrilla style. That was New York at its worst. It was dirty and dangerous, and real estate went for nothing. And artists essentially broke into the building and took it over and used it as studio space, used it as theater space. And the city in the early 2000s issued an RFP for the renovation of the building. The idea was that it would need to be renovated to be brought up to code, to be heated, to be safe. The artists were upset. They're like, wait, this is our place. You can't fix it. It won't be, why we're here. So we did this code upgrade, renovation, and then quite a bit more. One of the things we did was add this addition so that all of the contemporary stuff, like real bathrooms, an elevator, a properly scaled fire stair, and some other kinds of spaces that the building didn't have, could be added in the addition. There could be an on-grade entry, and where the old C.B.J. Snyder cornice had been, it had been removed decades ago. We installed, working with a light artist, this new cornice, and then made the roof a publicly accessible space. So here you see the building in the daytime. Here you see sort of the nature of our addition. And again, as at the University of Pennsylvania, what's new is new, what's old is old, and they don't go together on purpose, very much on purpose. Same with the stair railings. Don't pretend you can do this kind of iron work now. Do something of this time. And a radical move that we did was to put the theater not at the bottom where the columns were and the ceilings were low, but to take the roof off the building and put the theater up top. Two things happened. One, high open space was possible, and two, anybody going to the theater would have to walk through the floors that had the art galleries and other spaces on it, so it built more of a community within the building. So I think telling stories about buildings is the great joy of reusing old buildings. So at Harvard, at their law school, we transformed this building, 1959 modernist building by Shepley Bulfinch. This was the library for international law. So you had all the books from Ireland next to all the books from Iceland. Nobody needs a library like that anymore, right? Building was quite handsome, low ceilings, dark inside, except for this one glass room at the end. So we did this. Gave it a new front, gave it an addition on the top. You can see what we added in this drawing. It's the blue stuff. We moved the door from the center over to one side, so it allowed circulation through the law school campus, gave it a front door on Mass Avenue. And once again, I really only have two tricks. Save the columns, cut holes, that's it. If you do those two things, you can make any building look great. So in this building, we also cut holes because the ceilings were so low. And what we find in terms of building communities is people lean over the railings and shout to each other, which is a good thing. That's a good way to build communities. So you see that happening here. It now has faculty offices, classrooms, a center for digital freedom and internet privacy. You can see the construction going on here. So what we did for Harvard was not only did we save this building for them and give the law school a kind of front door on Mass Ave, which it needed, and a new circulation spine, but we analyzed for Harvard what it meant to save this building and to add onto it with the right kind of materials. And it essentially brought about a 40% reduction in its carbon footprint over what would have happened if we had built a new building. And what has happened at Harvard now is that This is the new criteria for all of their adaptive reuse projects, so I'm very excited about that. So I think when you practice like we do, you have to not just walk the walk in the building, in the work you do, but kind of walk the walk in the life you live. So at the office, we have exhibitions of artists whose work is perhaps under-recognized or not shown. We do continue to teach classes for young children to get people interested in design, construction, and planning. This is at the Cooper Hewitt. We make fun fact sheets for teenagers. I was once on the Ina Garten show. I'll tell you about that later if you want, but you try to get the word out there that, you know, design is something important for everybody. We do stores and work with lots of creative people. I could show you tons of pictures of retail and domestic spaces and, you know, these sort of aggressive surgical additions to brightly colored, brand new buildings. I like color. I like people who make things. I like texture. I like growing things. I think all buildings should have a real purpose and build community and cultivation and contemplation, my dog, and conversation, and be, whether it's a dormitory or a hotel or a residential property, I think our job as architects, designers, planners, historic preservationists, landscape architects, is really to embrace life and in the process make life better. So thank you very much.